Welcome everybody, and thanks for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us on this webinar. As Kristen mentioned, my name is Josh Bollig, and I am a part of the assurance department here at Wegner CPAs, and I've been with Wegner for a little over 4 years, and certainly enjoy the people and the clients that I work with very much. Earlier in my career at Wegner, I worked largely with for-profit entities, but pretty much exclusively through the last 2.5 years, I've worked exclusively with nonprofit organizations. So I think we can all agree that in the last 15 months, it's been quite a challenge, but I know me personally, I'm looking forward to things getting back to a little bit more of a normal, as much as they can be anyways. And with that said, I know we've all had many changes in our day-to-day lives, and I can remember back last March, when Wegner shut our offices down and I became a remote employee, and the difficulties and the adjustment that it took to work from home. I guess if there's a silver lining, if possible, during a pandemic, would be that businesses and organizations alike began to discover that we could still work productively in a remote environment, flexible schedules, things of that nature. And I think the world was moving slightly to that direction anyways, but certainly with COVID, definitely ramped up that need for flexibility in the workplace, remote work, things of that nature. With that said, being stationed largely in Madison, Wisconsin, and having a lot of our Madison area clients doing on-site field work due to social distancing requirements, we were kind of forced into doing virtual audits that may not have been the norm for a lot of our clients, especially in the Midwest. So that was one big adjustment that we had to make. And I guess before we really dive into the presentation, Kristen, if you could please launch the first polling question. So as a reminder, in order to earn your CPE, you'll need to answer 3 very simple, straightforward, multiple choice questions and to be eligible for that CPE. And so I'll give you a few seconds to answer. All right, just a few more seconds here if anybody else needs to answer. Alrighty, so looks like we have a little bit of a mix, but largely a lot of you have undergone virtual audits, which is terrific, but obviously some of you have not. So certainly great to see both sides represented. The goal today is to basically provide clarity on how us at Wegner CPAs will approach virtual audits, and then hopefully that will ease any concerns, stressors that you have as clients, maybe answer some questions on how the process is going to work and conduct in this way. So as I mentioned, I work within the nonprofit sector, and more specifically, I have worked in the last 2 years or so with clients out in New York City as well as the greater Washington, D.C. area. So being stationed in Madison, Wisconsin as my home base and office, as you can imagine, a very large percentage of my audits were already being conducted in this virtual environment. And this was even pre-pandemic. So I feel like I have a decent amount of experience working through this virtual environment, as well as I like to think at least that me and my clients have good relationships and a pretty good system in place. So as Kristen mentioned, as we started, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop those in the chat feature or wait till the end, and we can certainly answer those at the very end of the presentation. All right. So before we jump into some of the content, just wanted to run through a few common questions that I've received from clients when we've started virtual audits, as well as some of my colleagues who focus more on Madison, Wisconsin, Midwest-based clients who maybe historically we have gone and done on-site fieldwork with them, and now we're forced to do virtual audits for pandemic reasons or other reasons as such. So the first question that I've oftentimes heard from clients is, how will the process be different virtually? How processes, procedures, things like that. Another question I oftentimes have heard is, how will we know what type of support to provide the auditors? And in general, the short answer is, generally we need to look at the same type of documentation, whether we come to an on-site field work or we're doing it from a remote environment. The third question I often hear is completing an audit virtually taking significant more time to complete. And I would say generally our approach is to make sure that the virtual audit is as unified with our on-site physical fieldwork as possible. And we'll discuss that in more detail in the presentation. Another question that we often receive is, we enjoy speaking with the partner on the engagement. Will they be involved in a virtual environment? And yes, they will be in some type of capacity. Generally, we'll oftentimes have an exit conference call with you as the client once fieldwork is completed. But at a minimum, they will certainly be reviewing the work, posing questions to the audit team to bring back to the clients, and overall supervision of the audit. And one final question that we receive is, will you need to gain an understanding of our processes? In an on-site fieldwork in the past, you've observed our processes. Do you do this type of thing in a virtual environment? And the short answer to that is yes. And again, we will dive into that in more detail here in the presentation. So some learning objectives here that tie into some of those common questions that we generally receive from clients. The first learning objective is to understand the difference between virtual and physical fieldwork, with the obvious difference being that your auditors will be in a remote environment and not physically with you in person at the office. A second learning objective would be to what to expect in a virtual audit process. And this could be things such as, how are we going to receive and provide documents and files, how we plan on communicating, whether that be via email, conference call, video call, etc. And also how the timelines are driven during the entire process. Our third learning objective is how internal controls are tested in a virtual environment. So we are not coming to your offices. So how do we know controls are being performed, and what type of evaluation is needed for your internal controls? And our last learning objective today is ways to make this virtual audit process as efficient and as smooth as possible. And this can include being available and accessible to one another, client and Wegner, asking questions when things maybe aren't the most clear, and avoiding providing piecemeal requests and items. And again, we will dive into all of these in more detail as we continue on in the presentation. So our first learning objective, again, was the differences between virtual and physical fieldwork. So as mentioned, the obvious difference is your auditors will not be with you in person, and it'll be in a remote environment. The ability to walk down the hall to the executive director's office, the CFO's office, whoever, and ask questions freely is no longer a luxury under this type of environment. It'll be required a lot more planning to schedule calls, things of that nature are much more important. All documentation will be needed to be provided electronically. Now, I realize this may result in a little bit more time needed upfront for you as the client to provide us information, as potentially there are hard copies of documents or statements that need to be provided to us, and they might need to be scanned in. I certainly realize that this is probably a little bit less of an issue now than it was maybe 10 years ago, as most things are provided in physical copy as well as electronic copy. But nonetheless, if those situations occur, they'll just need to be scanned in. If for some reason there's documentation that is just not practical to be provided electronically, please discuss that with your auditors. One thing I can think of off the top of my head as a potential example would be, say there's a contract or a leasing document that is, let's say, 75 pages long. Don't know if that's really practical, if there would be a lease worth 75 pages, but for example's sake, we'll just use that. Perhaps your auditor and you could schedule a call to review the documents over the conference call or the video call. Or another option would be just to have the auditor ask you what type of pages provide the important terms for financial statement disclosure, things like that that are important as part of testing. Maybe you can just scan in a certain few pages. This isn't always necessarily preferred. We would love to have the documents in our files provided in PDF, but certainly we can make accommodations if that is not possible or feasible. I would say to that point, one benefit is that your auditors then will have copies of all the documents within our system and within our file. And that will allow us to be able to look back and reference items if possible. I know when I was out in on-site field work and working more with local clients to our firm, one of the big things was, we need to get the audit balances tested and reviewed documentation during physical field work, because once we leave the client's office, it's going to be tough to review documents. And if we would need to review a document again, we'd have to kind of go out of the way, email you as the client and say, hey, could you provide this document in PDF form anyways? So it really helps just being able to have those documents in PDF form to review pretty much at any time if necessary on our end. As mentioned, we're obviously not going to be meeting face-to-face in the office setting to discuss any issues or answer any general questions. So this is where scheduling a video or conference calls will be vital to hashing out any issues, and sometimes it's much more efficient than emails. Emails are certainly a good tool to schedule other calls, to provide very high-level answers, yes, no questions, things like that. But certainly when we're discussing more detail-oriented things, more complex issues, scheduling of video calls and conference calls seem to be the best way that we've found. And the last thing then is also the walkthrough of internal controls. So again, common theme here, we are not at your physical office location to review processes in person. So therefore, we often have a couple ways that we evaluate your internal controls of the organization. We may schedule a video call to observe over the computer screen your procedures, or we may as well ask that you provide us documentation of certain procedures to show that they're operating as intended. But again, we will walk through these details of internal controls later on in the presentation. So what to expect the audit process to look like. So our goal here at Wegner is to try to have the virtual audit process be as similar to physical on-site fieldwork as possible. So as a lot of you know, based upon the polling question and from experience, physical audit fieldwork on site is generally completed over 3 or 4 consecutive days at your office. And basically, the goal behind completing all of that audit work in those 3 or 4 days is to not have any questions or have as minimal questions as possible to be resolved when we leave the quote unquote fieldwork stage. Perhaps the only thing that we have left to do is prepare the financial statements for you as a non-attest service, something like that. For virtual audits, that's what we strive to do as well. Your auditor should develop a timeline with you and lay out what each party is responsible for and when. So as you can see on this next slide here, I have an example of what a potential timeline could look like for you and the client. So as you can see here, there's due dates, what party is responsible for what, and as well as the action items in the timeline. So for this example's sake, our client is ABC Nonprofit. And you will see here, the first item on the list is due June 1st. And that is the PBC list prepared by client list. And that list is generally provided to you so you can give us the planning fieldwork portion of the audit engagement, as well as some early initial documents that will be needed for the actual fieldwork portion. And we know that audits are very time consuming, and you as the organization are paying us a decent amount of money to do the work. So we realize there is a lot of initial planning work and assembly of documents for us that need to happen on your end. So that's why we kind of utilize a 2-week maybe 3 week up to a month lag period between when that PBC list items need to be provided to us and when they're provided to us and when we can start the work. So that preliminary information returning to Wegner on June 15th is generally items that will help us strategize our audit, plan our procedures, review the preliminary information, set materiality thresholds to which we're going to request documentation, and hold internal meetings within Wegner. So that's generally why you'll see that week lag between the June 15th date for the preliminary information and the fieldwork dates of June 22nd, is all that planning internally by Wegner is done that week. Then you'll see that there's those 3 or 4 consecutive days that are set aside for the fieldwork dates, and both parties will be going back and forth and hashing out any questions or potential issues, providing documentation, etc. Once the June 25th deadline or date comes and we are wrapping up our fieldwork, we generally say as a best practice that from last day of audit fieldwork to providing management with a draft of the audit report is about a 2 to 3 week process, give or take a few days. And basically we say it's about a 2 to 3 week process because the partner involved in the engagement needs time to review the work of the auditors that were doing the virtual fieldwork date. And if there's any questions that the partner may have in their vast years of experience that they'd like us to run by you as management of the organization, we'll certainly run those by you, get resolution and questions, tidy up our loose ends in our documentation, and make sure that the audit product is the best product that we can provide to you. And again, generally that'll take about 2 to 3 weeks, which is where we have that July 8th date, to which at that point, when we provide you that draft, management, the board of directors, your accountant, whoever you would like to review can review. And this process can really take as long as you need to review and make sure that all of your questions are answered on anything involved in the audit report. Once everything seems to be good from your vantage point, we'll have you sign the management representation letter, provide that back to us. And in this case, we just have a deadline date of 2 weeks after the draft of July 22nd. And after that rep letter is provided back to us, we usually try to turn around those final copies of the audit report within a week to you. So we're looking at around a July 29th finalization of the audit date for this client. And then as well, if your organization desires or is required to have a board presentation or a finance committee meeting presentation, we can certainly have that scheduled at a later date. So going back to what this process will look like from an initial standpoint, we realize that timeline oftentimes can be modified. We're all busy in our job responsibilities. We all have personal lives, unexpected events that may occur in our life. So it's generally okay if we need to modify the audit timeline slightly. The biggest thing, and really throughout this entire process, is that open communication needs to be had. So if for whatever reason, say the fieldwork date needs to be pushed back a week, we can just communicate that amongst both parties and just realize that every step pretty much after the modification will need to be moved back then that week. But certainly, again, not usually a problem. The only time when that may be an issue moving a timeline is if we're butting up against a deadline for a funding source, a state compliance, etc. But again, generally not a problem, just is crucial to have open communication about any delays. So around the same time that this timeline is being developed, your auditor should reach out and schedule a pre-audit call with you. And this is really a great way to get all parties on the same page before we hit the ground running in the audit work. So during this call, this timeline that we just talked about can be discussed in further detail. Oftentimes your auditor will reach out and ask, were there any changes in operations? Were there any new things that went on that historically your organization have not had? Just think questions like that can help us develop our expectations on what we'll see within the financial numbers. Also, this can be a forum as the client to ask us questions that you're unsure of. Say you're not sure what type of supporting documentation we'll need to review this year for a new item or a new transaction. Please ask us these questions. Any type of questions that you might have, concerns on how the virtual audit process will work, please, again, ask these questions during this call. It'll allow us to be most efficient during the audit and hopefully ease any concerns that you would have as a client. And around the same time that we've scheduled these calls, created a timeline, we'll also provide that audit PBC list if we're doing any tax work for you, 990 PBC lists, for-profit tax returns, whatever the case may be for your organization. We'll provide that list as well. And again, the items on these lists will help us begin to plan our audit and also help us with the initial fieldwork portion of the audit. So we will move ahead to the PBC list example. So as mentioned, this is our client, ABC Nonprofit. And please note that the June 15th deadline matches the deadline on our timeline for the preliminary information to be provided back for us before the start of fieldwork. So the items in this planning stage generally will include things such as board minutes, trial balances, some general ledger reports, and just other entity-specific documents. So some of those documents will include a understanding the entity document, and that is basically client-specific questions that we'll need to have you update, which allows us to gain understanding of any changes. Perhaps your address changed of your organization, maybe there was some personnel change, turnover, maybe some members of the board left, changes in policies and benefits, things of that nature would be updated on that document. And we'll also have just a general document called the Inquiries of Management document. And this document is just general questions that we ask all of our clients, high level, that will help us gain an understanding of what to expect throughout the audit. Now, again, these planning documents will allow us to take a preliminary review of your financial numbers as we'll import that into our software. And that will allow us to set our materiality threshold, which is the level that will help us select certain items that we'll want to review, which we will discuss later. Perhaps if your organization is subject to a compliance audit, we can pick samples based upon these items that were provided. And again, will help us plan and strategize our audit work and have internal meetings in preparation for that field work. This next piece of the PBC list pertains to the fieldwork portion of the items needed. Again, please notice the deadline date, which is June 22nd, and that matches the audit fieldwork date, day one of audit fieldwork. And that is when these items would likely need to be due to stay on time. And these fieldwork items are generally client specific, and they're not going to just be kind of one all fit all type of request. So for example, if you have investments, then those will be on your PBC list versus another client may not have investments, and then they would not be on their PBC list. But generally, these items will contain things such as bank statements, credit card statements, maybe you have a lease, any debt agreements, other contracts like that. And they'll also include supporting schedules that should tie back to the trial balance in the general ledger. So for example, here, this client has an accounts payable schedule. So we would expect if that accounts payable schedule to have $50,000 on it, then we would also expect that the trial balance in the general ledger would reflect $50,000. If the schedules do not tie to the trial balance and general ledgers, then it'll make it a lot more difficult to complete audit procedures, will likely delay the process as those schedules certainly need to tie back to the trial balance, general ledgers, and that'll be something that'll be a point of discussion between your auditor and you as the client. So you've gathered all those PBC list items and have them assembled in one place, and you're ready to provide those to your auditors. Your auditor should have set you up within our share file portal. And this is just a secure way to provide files and not just be provided through emails that are maybe less secure. I've certainly had clients in my experience that prefer to use their own type of secure portal, Google Drive, Google Docs, things like that. So certainly we don't mind how you provide us the documents, but just discuss with your auditor the route you'd like to go to provide the information. And after your auditors have had a chance to review the initial PBC document and audit schedules that tie to the trial balance. We will then assemble a second list that will include items that we will need for supporting documentation. And we oftentimes refer to this as the second request list. This list will often include grant award letters, certain revenue contracts, invoices, etc., that we will need to review. That's based upon that materiality threshold that we calculated during our preliminary work. This next slide here is a condensed version of a request list. So as mentioned, this request list houses grant award letters that will need support for, invoices for expense transactions, etc. One thing that I would like to bring to attention, because this is often something that I have discussions with my clients, is the wording in parentheses. So I've had clients in the past that will say, hey, Josh, so I have this one funder, they just don't provide any formal documentation. They don't provide us with a grant award letter. There's no contract. There's just really nothing. All they really do is just wire funds into our account. How can we provide good supporting sufficient audit evidence? And that's just something that you'll want to talk to your auditor. Oftentimes, in my experience, there'll be email correspondence per se from the executive director and the funder. And within that correspondence, the funder will often, provide the information that they'll need to donate, including if there's any restrictions on the funding, when they're going to provide the funding, the dollar amount, things of that nature. And being that that documentation is from that external third party, we would consider that to be sufficient audit evidence. So there's certainly ways that we can test audit revenue transactions based upon things that are not solely grant award letters or quote unquote formal documentation. Now, generally, we consider sufficient audit evidence, as many of you likely know, to be documents from external third parties. However, we realize this may be worth a discussion with your auditor, and perhaps there truly only is bank activity. And although we don't consider that the most sufficient audit evidence, we do acknowledge that it's representative of ins and outs in your bank statement. However, discussion with your auditor is important to hash out what we could do to test that further. Another example that I often see are we will select transactions that are large batch deposits that come from third-party processors, such as Stripe, PayPal, etc. Oftentimes what I will do then is I will ask my client to provide deposit detail that includes all individual transactions within that large batch deposit. So oftentimes what I'll be provided is a data dump in an Excel spreadsheet that shows all of those individual transactions that make up that larger deposit. And this way I can go through those individual transactions and select certain items that maybe we'd like to discuss further or gets further support provided. So that is one way that we'll definitely test that, and have found success testing that way. You also see the reference numbers in bold and the red font. So when providing supporting documentation, we please ask that you provide each item with labels of the corresponding reference number to our spreadsheet. This will allow us to be more efficient during our review of the transactions, and honestly will take less of a burden on your end as well, because we might oftentimes ask questions of you saying, especially if there's a routine funder who gives very, very, very similar dollar amounts throughout the year. We may ask you what line item corresponds to what PDF that you provided. So by using the corresponding reference numbers, we will be able to easily do that and hopefully cut down on the amount of questions that we would ask of you. So during that fieldwork portion of the audit, we will also reach out to you as your auditors to schedule a call to discuss internal controls and processes related to that. If you're an existing client, the call will largely be to discuss any changes in processes. Now, this could be due towards personnel changes, the adding of controls, changing staff responsibilities, etc. And we'll also discuss any potential prior year deficiencies or weaknesses that were identified in audits in past years. If you are a new client to Wegner, the call will be much more about understanding your processes and documenting those. but we will dive deeper into internal control testing here shortly. Again, as I had mentioned, after testing has been completed, there's generally that 2 to 3 week lag where the partner on the engagement will review the auditor's work, who were doing work as part of the field work, ask any questions that he may have. We can come back to you as the client, review those questions, get resolution, and then provide you a draft of the audit report. And then once you've had a chance to provide it to your board, your accountant, or others in management, and you've reviewed it, feel good about it, ask questions, you'll approve that audit with the representation letter. And again, we will then provide you those final issued audit reports within a few weeks, or likely a week, of that approval to have for your files. Now, generally, if we're doing any type of tax work, the 990 preparation, the business tax return, whatever the case may be for your organization, that'll likely come in completion a few weeks after the audit, simply for the fact that we generally like to make sure that the audited numbers are no longer going to change before we import into our software. So generally we see a little bit of a couple week lag for the tax returns to be issued. So with that, before moving on, Kristen, if you could please launch the second polling question. So the question is, which of the following is part of the virtual audit process? The first question or answer is setting up fieldwork dates and a general timeline. Second, scheduling a pre-audit call. Third, providing a PBC list to be returned. Fourth, walking through internal controls. Or the fifth answer, all the above are part of the virtual audit process. I'll give you a few seconds to answer. All righty, great. And yes, the correct answer is E. All of these steps are crucial parts to a successful virtual audit. So our third learning objective today is how are internal controls tested? So as briefly mentioned, if you are an existing client, we will provide you with the internal control narrative that we have on file from your prior year audit and ask you to update the narrative for any changes in these processes due to changes in staff members, staff responsibilities, change in controls, etc. If you also have a control policies or procedures manual at your organization, we'd please request that you'd provide that to your auditors for our files and to help evaluate internal controls. And after your auditor has had a chance to review that manual or the updated narrative, we'll schedule a call with you to discuss your processes. So generally we focus on a few processes in specific, as those are common in all organizations that we work with. And those processes are oftentimes the cash receipts process, the cash disbursements process, payroll processing, and if your organization is subject to a compliance audit, any of the compliance processes. However, depending on your organization's operations, there may be some other processes and activities that we would like to review. Processes such as procurement, or if you say you provide grants to individuals or other organizations, you may want to review your grant making process. So generally we say that there are two ways that we will test internal controls. Sometimes we implement both ways, or sometimes we will use one more so than the other. It largely just kind of depends on the operations of your organization. So the first way is to schedule video calls with you as the client and physically observe you walking through a process. So for example, we may want to review your mail opening process and procedure. So in that case, we'll observe you over the computer screen, opening the mail with two people, preparing your deposit check log, making the deposit, etc., whatever is involved in that process. Now, I realize in this COVID environment, and many of us are working remotely from our houses, that this may not be the most effective method in this moment, as procedures can tend to be drastically different working from home versus in the office. But I know historically we've used this approach when everybody was in the office as well. The second option to testing and walking through internal controls is generally the approach that I use most frequently, and that involves providing your auditors supporting documentation to show that the controls that are in place are operating as so. So I have some general examples that we oftentimes see during our walkthroughs of internal control procedures. One example is, say you have a board member who is reviewing your bank statements or your credit card statements, perhaps expense reimbursements or payroll reports. If they're signing off on these statements and these documents, we'd likely just ask that you provide us an example of that signed statement or document. It helps us show that that control is being operated as intended. Another way that I've seen this documented is that the board, say the board treasurer, will email the executive director and say, hey, I reviewed statements for February and other documentation. Everything looks good and I approve. No further questions. Well, then in that case, we would like to ask if you could provide us the email of that approval from the board treasurer. An example related to testing of payroll would be, say that your employees fill out timesheets and they are required to be signed by a supervisor and approved. Perhaps we can request a pay period, and you provide all the timesheets for that pay period, and we can see that all timesheets were approved by an appropriate level of a supervisor. A third example would be, say you utilize a donor database and you reconcile to your accounting software on a quarterly basis. We would then recommend that you provide us a quarterly reconciliation. Another example related to cash disbursements would be, say that your organization utilizes a check request form, and the person that has received the invoice is going to fill out that check request, attach the invoice, and send to the supervisor for review and approval and signing of the check. We would ask that you provide an example of that check request form used with the attached invoice and signed approval from the appropriate supervisor. And one final example that I've oftentimes seen would be in terms of wire transfers. So let's say one of the controls is there's required dual authorization to set up wire transfers within the banking website. Perhaps you could provide a screenshot from the banking website showing that, say, the executive director and board treasurer both needed to approve that wire transfer for setup and payment. So based upon our call and review of that narrative, we will then provide any potential recommendations, deficiencies, weaknesses that we identify in internal controls, and report that in the management letter that accompanies the audit report. So our last learning objective today is to how to make the virtual audit process more efficient. So the first point we have here is to be available and accessible. So we recommend, even during the audit fieldwork, to schedule time during each day to answer calls and provide any further documents. So for example, let's say every day at 3 o'clock during the audit fieldwork, we're going to schedule a call, talk about any questions that may have come to light during those audit processes for the day, and perhaps provide some other documentation. It also is appreciated if you could potentially provide us with times you'll be unavailable during those fieldwork days. So let's say Tuesday of fieldwork, you as the executive director are meeting with a funder for lunch, and you will be gone 11:30 in the morning till 1 p.m. in the afternoon. Please communicate that to your auditors, and that way we know to provide you questions maybe by 10 a.m., or we will wait until after you return, say at 1:30, 2 o'clock. And then we continue to work on other things that don't require resolution from questions that we may have for you. Calls versus emails. So emails are great for quick questions, yes or no answers, things like that, very high level questions. But we have found during our auditing virtually that conference calls and video calls are much more efficient. To be honest with you, I've really enjoyed the video calls. Prior to the pandemic, I had mainly just operated with conference calls. But due to the pandemic, I started using the virtual calls over Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc. And it's really been rewarding to actually kind of put faces to names and discuss what feels like across the table from each other. So I've certainly enjoyed that. But regardless, we could also do a conference call. And we've just found that this is easier to talk about more complex issues, more detail-oriented issues, things such as questions related to revenue recognition, internal controls, more detail-oriented things. That is largely what calls are the best for and most efficient for. The next item here is to try and stay on the schedule with the agreed upon timeline as much as possible. Again, we noted that certainly modifications to the schedule can and will happen, but certainly from both ends, it helps facilitate the audit much more smoothly. From your end as the client, it'll help us wrap up the audit in a much more efficient and quick manner, which I'm sure is both of our goals really. And from our standpoint as your auditors, we often allocate staff to assist with work based upon these audit timelines. So it just allows us to better allocate work and provide a much more quality and efficient product to you. This next point is probably my most favorite point and the point that I like to stress home the most in terms of efficiency in the audit process. And that is to provide your auditors, when at all possible, with accountant access to any softwares that you may utilize. So that can be your accounting software, such as QuickBooks, or other softwares that you utilize, such as Bill.com, etc. I can speak from experience that I have several clients who provide me with accountant access to their QuickBooks. And this really allows me to go in, run trial balance reports, run general ledgers, run aging schedules, run bank reconciliations, things like that. And that really cuts out the amount of time that you as the client need to spend providing preliminary information, because I can go in and do all those reports myself. And I think that just helps with the efficiency, make sure that the reports that we need we're getting, and perhaps cuts down on any confusion that may be provided in the PBC list. Also, I have clients who utilize Bill.com, and Bill.com is great for basically two purposes from an auditor standpoint. I can go into Bill.com, I can review the audit trail and who has what responsibilities within Bill.com, who can approve bills, who can enter bills, how the bills get paid, things like that. And that's great evidence for us to utilize as part of our control testing. So not only is it great for controls, it's also great that I can review any invoice, any bill that is entered into Bill.com and use that as part of my audit testing. So when we would normally send that second request list, I can go right in and review invoices and not necessarily have to add that on the request list for you as a client, which in turn makes less work for you. So I think all around, it's just a great way to cut down on some documentation and back and forth between client and auditor. One thing that I would consider to be quote unquote the holy grail of providing access would be, I have a few clients that provide us QuickBooks access and actually attach grant award letters and invoices directly to the transactions within the QuickBooks. I think this is terrific, and quite honestly, significantly reduces the amount of time that clients need to spend providing us documents, as I can literally go in, run reports, run aging schedules, etc., and then go directly into the QuickBooks, drill down, and review the documentation related to those transactions. In this case, the back and forth between client and auditor is very, very minor, and really only for controls, general inquiries, and just to discuss any questions or issues that may come up. But in terms of providing us documentation, I pretty much can do that as your auditor going into these documents and into this software, which is terrific. And I always have a positive experience utilizing access from clients. And not to worry, a lot of these access that are provided as the accountant access will not allow us to change any numbers or perhaps by accident delete something within there. Don't fret, that is a kind of a control in there that we won't be able to adjust anything within your QuickBooks. One other thing is really from both sides, but certainly the client, don't be afraid to ask questions of your auditors. If there's something that is unclear to you in the request list, if you're not sure what you'd expect or your auditor would expect for sufficient audit evidence, please reach out and schedule a call or shoot an email over to us. I know me personally, I really appreciate when a client will ask me questions on what I'm expecting to see for documentation purposes. It would be unfortunate to see you as a client spend a lot of time providing us documents that maybe we need further support for. And then for us to review on our side as well. It'll just cut down on the amount of back and forth and the amount of work that will be needed if we can all get on the same page exactly what needs to be provided. So certainly be willing to ask questions and let us know what's easiest for you. And the last piece here is to avoid providing piecemeal items, and this comes for both sides. That's generally why we take the approach to provide a PBC list and then also a second request list. We try to provide these two large lists. So say there's 50 items on each list, they're only in two spots. We found an experience if we send you 25 emails with 2 requests on each email, that is much harder to keep track of. And we all receive many, many emails each day, and emails are certainly easily lost. So by providing just those two large lists of 50 requests each, we all have it in one spot. We can easily tell what's been provided, and it just facilitates for a more efficient and smooth audit. And with that, Kristen, could you please launch our third and final polling question? So the question is, what is the ways to make the virtual audit process more efficient? The first, be available and accessible. Provide the auditor with software access. Avoid providing piecemeal requests, or the final answer, always make the audit process more efficient. And I will give you all a few seconds here to answer. All right, let's see the results. And terrific, you all got it. Yes, all of these are ways to make the audit process more efficient. So one final thing that I wanted to just talk about, and this is not necessarily virtual audit specific, but even physical on-site fieldwork as well, is just the procedures regarding post-audit work and planning for the next year's audit. So one thing that we oftentimes see and want to discuss with clients is the posting of journal entries from the audit into your accounting software. So as you know, during the PBC list, information provided, the unadjusted trial balance is given to your auditors. Your auditors will then import that into our software. And then during our audit procedures, we will discuss with you as management any potential adjustments that need to be made. And we'll make those journal entries in our software, and then that will be reflected in the audit report. Well, there was obviously going to be a discrepancy between the audit report and the trial balance in your accounting software. So we ask that upon finalization of the audit, that you go in and post those journal entries to your software so that our software is exactly the same as your software in your books. This will allow for a much more smooth process in planning for next year's audit. Come next year's audit, when you provide that trial balance, there won't be any discrepancies between our software and your software, which can lead to some additional questions and a little bit of inefficiency going back and forth on questions in entries from the prior year. Another thing that I oftentimes recommend is to utilize your auditors throughout the year. We're a professional services firm, and our big push is to, let our clients know that we are available throughout the year and not just come audit time. If you have a question about how to treat something in your financials, maybe it's a new transaction that you're unfamiliar of, or you've done some preliminary research on and you're still just really not sure, feel free to run it by us. Perhaps we can do some additional research and help get that recorded in the correct way so that come audit time, the audit will be smooth and we'll have discussed these type of issues. Another thing that I often recommend is to consider implementing any suggestions or recommendations that we make in the management letter. Again, certainly not required to make any of those recommendations and implement them. Those are simply just best practices that we've seen in our experience with other organizations of similar sizes. And oftentimes, cost benefit analysis, things like that need to be evaluated, practicality for implementation of certain controls or suggestions. So if you find that the cost outweighs the benefits, certainly don't feel obligated to implement any recommendations, but as part of our service to you, we want to just provide those as best practices. And finally, the last thing would be just to let your auditor know how things went from your perspective. So if you had any frustrations among certain things, were confused about what we were asking during the process, whatever the case may be, just please be willing to schedule a call with your auditor or send an email to your auditor. And again, we oftentimes know that this audit is not always voluntarily done, and you as the management may be required to head it, and it's strictly for state compliance or a funder compliance. And our job here is to just be on the same page as you. We're on the same team, make it as smooth of a process as possible, and hopefully not too painful in completing that. So that's generally some recommendations that we will make going forward. So with that, I just wanted to thank you all for your time. And hopefully that helped answer some questions that you may have had or ease some concerns. Kristen, is there any questions that we have at all?
Yep, we have just a few minutes left here, Josh, and there are some questions that came in for you that I'll read. The first one is, I wonder how the auditors compensate for not observing the environment in the physical office. I think you may gain information from being in the building and just briefly observing the situation, even outside of accounting.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That is a terrific question. And that is part of our questionnaires that we oftentimes provide. As I'd mentioned, the general entity question, we can kind of get a feel of employees, the types of employees that are there in terms of job responsibilities and whatnot. But also we will, as part of our audit, are required to talk to several individuals within the organization. So oftentimes we'll talk with maybe the accountant, and then maybe a program manager and the executive director. And then we're also required to meet with at least one member of the board. So we can kind of get an idea of the environment within the organization by talking to several different levels of employees and even those on the board. So hopefully between conversations with all of them, we can get a sound understanding of the type of environment that the organization works under.
Thanks, Josh. The next question is, will you talk more about attaching grant award letters to the QuickBooks software? Is there a way to do that within the software itself?
Absolutely, yes. So without being able to kind of just do it here, and I'm much more of a person who can learn through observation. Basically, there is a way within QuickBooks, and I'm speaking QuickBooks specifically, but I know there's other accounting softwares that are similar in this facet, to go into the individual transaction, and there's a little spot, I believe, below where the entry is to record the information. And I think it's just like an attachment. You can simply upload documents right into this attachment, and they'll sit right within that transaction. So for example, if I were to go into your general ledger and click on a certain transaction, that'll provide me the detail of the transaction, the accounts that were hit as part of that transaction to record the transaction, and then a little box at the bottom that show any attachments that can be provided. So that's pretty straightforward, and it's pretty easy for your auditors as well when they go in to see that. And I believe that is the same way that you can attach documents as well.
Another QuickBooks question here. My QuickBooks subscription only allows 2 accountants and we have 2 included. We could temporarily trade one of them for Wagner if we are able to restore the access after the audit. Is that acceptable?
Sure. So we are certainly not asking or requiring anybody of our clients to take on additional costs to add additional users by any means. So again, a little bit of a practicality on that. If you only have 2 users and those users are vital to being on the QuickBooks, then I guess in that situation, probably makes more sense for you as the client to just provide us those reports. If you are able to take one of those people off temporarily, and that's what you would choose to do, we certainly can do that as well. But by no means are we asking you to inconvenience the organization in any means to just provide us access. You certainly can also still just provide us the reports in the PBC list.
One more question here. What, if any, effect has the efficient virtual audit had on related annual audit fees?
So that I cannot speak to totally, as there's a lot of factors that go into that. A lot of that has evaluation between the partners and discussions with management as well. It's definitely a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't necessarily say that it influences one way or the other. There's, again, a lot of considerations that go into it, such as audit areas, things like that. So that would be probably a question to discuss further with your specific auditor and the partner on those engagements, as that's definitely a kind of a case-by-case basis for each client. So.
Great. Those are all the questions I have. Josh, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and expertise on this topic. We certainly learned a lot, and thanks to everybody that joined in with us today. If any questions do come up after this presentation, please feel free to reach out to Josh. I'm sure he'd be happy to discuss things further with you. Absolutely. That's all we have for you today. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.